Well, so thank you very much for this introduction. What I want to do is talk about climate fiction and talk especially about the notion of climate fiction novels as models of and for climate future. So what are functions of climate fiction in this whole discussion? And what I want to do is talk about 20, maybe 25 years of climate change fiction. So maybe the years 2000 to 2020, roughly what I call the first two phases of climate change fiction, and some of the problems that have become apparent in trying to use novels as climate change communication. I want to talk about model theory. What is model theory, and why do I argue that climate change fiction needs more model theory and climate change fiction research needs more model theory? And one thing we're seeing is that in the last few years, more and more climate fiction novels have very explicitly turned to model theory and are much more aware that novels themselves can be some kind of climate change novels can be some kind of model, alternative model, a different way of modeling climate futures as opposed to, say, IPCC reports or mathematical quantitative climate models. I also want to insist on the aesthetic dimension, as I call it. So we need to read fiction as fiction. And the function of climate change novels, I will argue, is not to transport facts about climate change, but to do something very different. And to see that, we need to talk about it as fiction. This is something that's become apparent in the last phase of climate change fiction, roughly in the last maybe 5 years. And I want to talk about two different models, two different ways of using climate change fiction. One is what I call the despair model. So this idea that, we're doomed and the only thing climate fiction can do is emotionally to prepare us for doom. And the other model is what I call inspiration. So climate change novels that point a way into the future and create hopeful transition scenarios for the next few decades. My two examples would be Kim Stanley Robinson, Ministry for the Future, and Stephen Markley's The Deluge. Both of them are of the inspiration type, I would say, and I have just a brief example of a despair model because it seems fairly simple, and a few ideas in conclusion. So the context for this is two projects, and you mentioned one of them already, the climate change literacy project that I did with Julia Hoydes and Roman Bartosz. This is the project that led to this little book from last year, Climate Change Literacy. And the other project is an ongoing one on just futures and interdisciplinary approach climate models, where we argue that climate models are not just IPCC reports and quantitative models, but that social media posts, essays, novels, plays can also function as an alternative type of climate model. So if anyone is interested, there's the climate change literacy book that's out, open access. It's downloadable for free at the CUP website. And the Routledge book has a chapter on climate novels as models of and for climate futures, which is basically the foundation for what I'm talking about today. That's also in open access if anyone wants it. I have the link at the end. So if you think about the last 25 years, there are, of course, forerunners of climate change fiction in the 1980s. There are a few novels that talk about a significantly warmer, sometimes also a significantly cooler world, and discuss questions of how does humanity deal with a radically changed climate. But really, you could say that climate change fiction, in the sense that we now use it, emerged around the year 2000. And so one of the things we're seeing is in this first phase, roughly until the early 2000s, is climate change in these novels is a pretty diffuse issue among other issues. So there's biodiversity loss, there's desertification, there's acid rain, there's death of the forests, etc. And climate change fiction is one among many problems, and it's not really an issue for fear. So the sense is it's something that will happen in the very distant future, and it's something we need to be concerned about, but it's, nothing immediately dangerous. And then in the second phase, I would say maybe 2004, 2005, as with any such phases, they're not set in stone. Nobody decided on the 1st of January 2005 to suddenly write different climate novels. So these phases overlap. But I do think that something changed in the second phase. What is becoming much more common is very drastic representations of climate change. And it's often pretty obvious that what these novels are trying to do is to shock people into recognition or to shock them into action by evoking fear, often with drastic scenarios. and very often with what is called in climate change fiction studies info dumping. So characters lecturing on climate science, and you get the climate facts pretty in very unsubtle ways because a climate change scientist gives a 20-page lecture. In this phase, also what you find is climate change is becoming a topic in a very broad range of genres. So, realist fiction, comic fiction, almost any genre talks about climate change. And one reason for that, it's been argued, is that the more immediately obvious it becomes that climate change is a problem, the less realistic novels seem that don't have anything to say on climate change. So the extreme version of that argument is that in the very near future, every novel will have to be, in some sense, a climate change novel, because a novel that deals with our present day world and that ignores the fact of climate change will simply be read as unrealistic. So what we find in the last, say, 15 years is that a lot of different genres use climate change. What you also find, and these are some of the most widely discussed novels that have the largest number of critical reviews, the largest number of Goodreads entries, the largest number of book club discussions, is that you generally find that the dates of projections have tended to move closer to the present. So novels in the early 2000s may have been set 25 years in the future, and the dominant trend in recent novels, even only 15 years later, is that they're looking at the immediate future, the very near future, or even the present. The only exception is the one that I've marked here. The Wind-Up Girl, published 2009, is set in 23rd century Thailand after environmental apocalypse. And my suspicion is that if that novel was written now, it probably wouldn't be set 2 centuries in the future, but something like maybe 2040 or 2050. So there is evidence of a growing sense of urgency, and the fact that these future projections have tended to move closer to the present suggests that it's no longer something we regard as being, in the safe, distant future. So one of the odd things about these early novels is that they often seem oddly humorous, even end on a happy note, and seem to take climate change as something, well, no big deal. So the ending of that Our Friend of the Earth novel from 2000 ultimately ends on an optimistic note, with nature coming back with a soft, pale evening. He's back with his wife after 20 years of separation. And then in the last few lines, that's when the girl appears, and there's a chirp to a voice that brings me back 37 years when his own daughter was young. So there's a sense that it ends on a return of nature, a return of love, a return of happiness, and everything's basically fine. This is also borne out in this cover image of the dead frog, because a dead frog isn't an environmental catastrophe. It's just one dead frog that got run over by a car or whatever. So there is this sense that there isn't really any reason to be afraid, or is there? So what you find in Goodreads comments 2017, 2018, 2019 is that people find this a somehow funny novel. They sometimes comment on the oddly sexist humor that seems misplaced after Me Too. But they also comment on the fact that this really doesn't seem like such a topical novel. It's 2000 and it's dated. It doesn't seem a very fresh novel. And then these perceptions change, because in 2020, with the COVID pandemic, you suddenly have passages that you realize have always been there, but you now see for the first time. So there's talk of a mucosa epidemic that hit 3 years ago. There's talk of Laurie died in my arms. Bertha was wearing gaze masks. The mucosa so thick in her lungs and throat she couldn't draw breath. We all wore masks and kept strictly to ourselves. Now, these passages are obviously there even before the year 2000. People didn't seem to have noticed them. People just read over them. And so this Goodreads comment from 2020, from June, so 5 months into the pandemic, is pretty representative. Here a Goodreads reader says, I don't recommend reading this during a pandemic. I had to put it aside because it was too depressing. Mucosa virus and masks, I'm not even sure why I pressed on to get through. Perhaps I did it for the animals. I certainly didn't find the humor people keep mentioning in reviews. Maybe the humor is there and too close to home at the moment during the pandemic, so I couldn't see it. So there's a sense in which the pandemic changed the perception of that novel and suddenly made such passages that didn't seem all that prominent before appear very prominent. You also find this in the covers of the same book over time. So what you find in the very few years between the first English edition of the Carbon Diaries is a girl playing bass in a rock band to covers on fire. And this is fairly representative. You find this with a lot of novels that even in 2, 3, 4 years, covers have changed from suggestions of nature to something pretty drastic about climate change and the world's on fire. So it seems there's clearly more of a sense of urgency. And so this response by a young commentator on the Carbon Diaries, who said in 2012, so 4 years after the novel was published, it had me rolling around in laughter at some points and thoughtful at others. My suspicion is very few people reading the novel now would find it particularly funny. Still the same novel, still the same passages, but things that may have seemed funny in 2008 or 2012 probably to most people now wouldn't seem funny. The argument I would make is that this is the result of a growing sense of urgency, that if you ask people in the street, what was the year when you were personally first really scared of climate change and afraid that this was really going to be a problem, a lot of people would probably say something like 2018, 2019. It was known to a lot of people that it was going to be a problem, but with the wildfires in Australia, with the floods in the Ahrtal in Germany, with droughts, with wildfires, etc., it became so much clearer that this was actually a present day problem already. And a lot of people mentioned 2018, 2019, 2020. So, the fact that Fridays for Future was founded in 2018 probably isn't a coincidence. The sense of urgency just seems so much greater. So what I've done is a timeline from the year 2000 to 2021, 22, mapping a number of the most widely discussed climate change novels against key events in climate science. So the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the publications once every few years by thousands of leading experts on climate change, summarizing the present state of research on climate change. And then putting that together with individual events, Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans in 2005, the Copenhagen Summit, Hurricane Sandy that flooded New York in 2012, the Paris Agreement, Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg's speech in Davos, the I Want You to Panic speech, and then the year 2020, 2021, with the heat waves and floods in a lot of places all over the world. I'm obviously not arguing here that the novelists publishing climate change novels in 2008, in 2007, read the IPCC report and said, let's turn this into a novel. That's obviously not the way fiction works. But what this suggests is that these waves of publications of climate change novels around 2010, and then a second massive wave around 2019, 2020, do suggest a changed perception of climate change as something that is imminent, that is becoming more of a problem. And so some of the problems, pitfalls, challenges of climate change communication that became apparent in these first 20 years is what is often called the preaching to the choir problem. You could call it an audience problem. So we know that those who would need climate change communication are those who don't know the facts but need to be told they don't read climate fiction. And those who do read climate fiction because they already know we have a problem. So you don't reach the people we would most urgently need to reach. And one of the reasons for that, we suspect, is that there are fairly common assumptions about what literature does, but we argue it doesn't do, but is often expected to do. And the central problem, of course, behind this is what psychologists and sociologists know as the mind-behavior gap. We know what we should be doing, but we're not doing it collectively and individually. And two of the reasons for that is what we call the cognitive fallacy. So we argue that literature doesn't primarily transport facts. And so this idea of info dumping, having a climate scientist lecture on climate change for 20 pages of the novel, conveying facts to people who otherwise wouldn't know them, we empirically know that knowledge about facts just doesn't translate into behavior change. It just doesn't. And the other thing that's often expected is that sympathy for and empathy with likable climate heroes or heroines or, cute animals, polar bear babies or seal babies, just empirically doesn't lead people to behavior change. There's an empirical study that people did when the film Babe, so a little piglet that's horribly mistreated on a huge farm and is in danger of basically being turned into a sausage. After leaving the cinema, people said that they're going to be vegetarians, they're going to change their ways, they're not going to eat meat again. And then empirically, thousands of people who had said that after the film were asked a few weeks or months later, and it became clear that almost nobody had, changed their behavior in the long run. So we simply empirically know that it just doesn't lead to our behavior change. Would this make us give up and say, well, okay, then let's just give up? Climate change fiction obviously doesn't do anything, might as well stop reading. We would say no, climate change fiction does do things, but it's a little more complex. And so in response to this preaching to the choir problem, in response to the idea that info dumping and conveying facts simply doesn't work, and that making people afraid doesn't work, a colleague of mine is in several advisory boards to German ministries who put together the curriculum for school. And he reports that you shockingly often hear, the bureaucracy and the educational bureaucrats arguing that we need to make young people afraid by giving them apocalyptic scenarios in school books or in novels that they read at school. We think that's cynical and obviously nonsense, because where did Fridays for Future start? At school. If anyone is aware of a problem, it's young people, and they don't need to be shocked into recognition by fear mongering. So if all of these are problems, there seems to be an increasing need to sort of light the way, and to, rather than shock people and hit them over the head with a club, there's this idea of creating inspiring future scenarios. And this has become clear in other genres. There is climate change drama, short plays, 5-10 minutes, 2 actors, 3 actors, no props needed, can be performed in pubs, can be performed in market squares, can be performed at festivals, to suggest brighter futures and to strike a balance between a sense of urgency and a sense that there is something people can do. The argument I would want to make is that model theory is central to that. And so the question is, what is model theory? And this emerged in the 1970s with Herbert Stachowiak has a book, Allgemeine Modelltheorie, General Theory of Models, in which he argues that what any model, whether it's a model in physics, whether it's a model in biology, whether it's a computer model, whether it's a built model in plaster or cardboard or wood, what any model does is it represents some kind of reality. It simplifies that reality to make it representable in the first place, and a model has some kind of function. And he speaks of representation, simplification, and application or usage. And the last few years have seen a remarkable interest in model theory. And one of these theorists is Bernd Marr, who says that we should further distinguish between what he calls model of and model for. And so you have the German original at the bottom and the English, which I'm using here at the top. And this is, a model is always based on something of which it's a model, so some kind of more complex reality that it represents. And the purpose of building or choosing a model is to use it for something. And one of the typical ways in which we use models is as a means of designing or creating something. So models can be samples, preformations, specifications, instructions for how to do things. And then he says you can really only understand how models work if you explain and if you understand that any model is a model of something, so a simplified representation of something, and a model for something, a future-oriented design manual, an instruction that helps you create something. And what I would argue is that models, yes, they can be both, but these functions can occur in very different proportions. So you could, of course, say some models are primarily representations. If you have a toy model, a small car model in wood or whatever, that's a model of reality, a simplified model of a real car, but it isn't necessarily very forward-looking. It's not necessarily a model for something. Whereas if you take a plan of a building, um, of how a building should be built or how a neighborhood is supposed to look in the future, that's an instruction manual of how to build the future and is more of a model for something. And these can occur in various proportions and amalgamations and mixtures. So a related idea is what Bornheim has called retrospective models, so models that look back to something that exists already, and prospective models, that look forward to the future. You see, as a toy model shows what is, whereas an architectural model points forward to the future and shows what could be. And adapting this, you could say that a model could be in varying degrees and sometimes only implicitly both a descriptive representation, a simplified representation of something that exists already, of which it's a model, and again, implicitly, a forward-looking idea for a future state of that. So some kind of future scenario, some kind of blueprint, some kind of instruction manual. And so more specifically, I would say we could build on Ma and Bornheim and say, models in their future orientation could have different functions. So the model for the prescriptive, the looking into the future, could come in various shapes. One could be prescriptive, normative, basically as a blueprint saying this is what we should do. And most climate change novels are, at least to some extent, prescriptive, if only in the way that they describe a certain future that is portrayed as so shocking, so terrible, so undesirable, as a threat, that this is obviously something we cannot possibly want. This would be the prescriptive, saying how it should be or saying how it should not be. The more predictive sense would be models make predictions about futures. And we may say, climate change models, quantitative climate change models, atmospheric models, ocean current models, in a sense, predict scenarios of how the world will most likely look. We can here, of course, wonder whether climate change fiction really does that. It's not, I would say, the task of climate change novels to make such predictions, but really to illustrate the predictions made in other types of atmospheric scientific models. All climate change models, future models, can be explorative in the sense that they develop possible, sometimes even alternative scenarios, ideas playing through simulation spaces for future scenarios. So basically playing out scenarios and making it possible to experience what the future might look like. Because if you take an IPCC scenario and say, in 2040 something, the world will be 1.9 degrees hotter than at present, what does that tell us? Whereas what a novel could do is to illustrate what that world might look like by showing the lives of characters in the year 2040. So explore potential futures. And one of the, I think, interesting observations is that in none of these very popular novels from the first 15 years of climate change fiction, modeling doesn't really play a big role. The only novel that has any talk of climate modeling is 40 Signs of Rain. In all the other novels, models really only appear in the sense of a car model, a fashion model, a model toy, or as a role model. But the activity of modeling climate futures doesn't play a role, and these novels don't seem to be conscious of the fact that they themselves might be read as models. And this is surprising, given the fact that modeling is so central to both climate science, and the results of these climate models are so central to our discussions about climate. It's surprising that in climate novels there is so little, almost no talk of climate modeling. And this is not just true of these novels, but of the vast majority of climate novels from the first, say, 20 years. But one of the problems, of course, is that people read climate novels as models, even where they may not be meant as models. So Schneider-Meyerson has an essay on Odds Against Tomorrow, which is this 2012 novel about a climate scientist and a risk analyst who basically makes tons of money by selling insurance companies ideas about how to, prevent future disasters. And so none of the readers of Odds Against Tomorrow that he empirically studied appeared to read the novel as a satire. So it's a novel about how capitalism manages to turn even dire climate predictions into a capitalist money-making machine for risk consultants. And some people read this novel basically as a lesson in disaster preparedness. So, this climate scientist in novel makes predictions about climate change, and so people read this as maybe I should stock up on tomatoes and tinned pasta or something to prepare myself for climate futures. And it seems that's a reductive reading of the novel. But the observation I'm taking from this is that we tend to read novels as models anyway, even if we're not aware of model theory. I'll come back to this in a moment. What I want to do for the moment is to insist that we need to read novels as opposed to reading them as climate, as kind of, instruction manuals or Trojan horses for facts. So one of the arguments we're making is that even if climate change novels don't necessarily directly lead to behavior change, they do have a potential, they do have a function. And we use the theory of narrative from our discipline literary studies and cognitive literary studies. How do people respond empirically to texts to argue that they do more than facts? So one of the things climate novels are uniquely good at is they make a global phenomenon like climate change apparent, visible, makes it possible to experience climate change at a local level. What does climate change not mean globally? What does climate change mean at the local level for individuals? So it makes it possible to experience climate change as opposed to telling us that the world will be 1.x degrees warmer, which doesn't really tell us very much. And what climate change novels uniquely do is they show climate change plus X. So climate change novels basically never talk about climate change as an isolated phenomenon, but talk about climate change and the social consequences, climate change and the economic consequences, climate change and the environmental consequences, etc. And so this idea, as Margaret Atwood calls it, we shouldn't really call it climate change. We should call it everything change, because it's not just climate change. So climate change as a complex problem, as a wicked problem that is entangled with all sorts of other problems. That's something climate change fiction does uniquely well. And the other thing it does is it gives us something like a complex form of identification. So, reading about likable climate protagonists or reading about cuddly animals doesn't directly translate into change behavior, but we can critically identify with characters. We have very complex processes. We realize, oh shit, this character is like us. This is a character who is just as irresponsible as we are. And we argue that that's much more effective than a direct identification would suggest. And it allows us to change perspectives. It allows us to see the world from characters in different environments, different social classes, different ethnic groups, different communities, different parts of the world. And it allows us to tell stories of successful transformation, what has been called socio-ecological transition narratives. And the example I will talk about in a moment is Ministry for the Future, which starts in the year 2020 something and then moves on into the 2050s and basically shows how humanity will have managed the transition into a more sustainable future. One of the things that is necessary here is to understand that we need to read fiction as fiction. And here's an example. Odds Against Tomorrow is a novel that has this, as I said, this risk analyst live through a disastrous flood in Manhattan. And at the end of the novel, he lives on some kind of beach outside New York and basically makes a living there, fending for himself, growing vegetables, etc., and taking care of himself. And Matthew Schneider-Myers, in a reading of that novel, argues, and this is a quote from the novel from the last few pages, walking around the property, swinging the axe, he, the protagonist, felt for the first time as if he owned the land. The Canarsie Bank Trust, as well as the adjacent plot, whatever it had been, was his domain. This is a quote from the ending of the novel, and the critic then says this is a Lockean claim that by making use of the land, Sukarno owns it, so a colonialist claim. This is particularly problematic from a justice perspective. While Flatlands, this is the area that he now makes a living in, might seem like the end of the earth from the vantage point of Manhattan's Upper West Side, where Rich, the author of the novel, was raised. In the real world, it's a stable middle-class neighborhood of 60,000 people, home to African Americans, Caribbean, Latinxs, and generously organized, etc. So this is a novel that wasn't even flooded during Hurricane Sandy. So this critic, somewhat narrow-mindedly, I find, says the novel says something about the Flatlands area that isn't historically true. To recapitulate, two white, wealthy, educated 20-somethings in the novel find a complicated financial means to profit of climate disasters by selling, risk consulting to insurance companies, and then use these funds to settle a destroyed minority neighborhood where they discover themselves by working the land. The echo of settler colonial land appropriation and historical erasure is too loud to ignore. Then they accuse the author of apparent ignorance of settler colonial ideological implications, and the absence of diversity and climate justice in the novel make this a really pernicious and deficient framing of climate change. Because one of the things that happen in the novel is when, after the disaster, the protagonist comes to one of these rescue shelters and sees poor African American families and makes disparaging comments about them, that these are provincial people who aren't, Manhattan urbanites. And the question, of course, is this a novel that is blind to privilege? Is this a privileged, wealthy, white, middle-class New York author who writes a novel that's blind about privilege? Or is this a novel that satirizes the blindness of a wealthy, white, middle-class Manhattan protagonist who is ignorant about his own privilege and who makes disparaging comments about poor people? So it seems to us that, subtle as this critic usually is, he here reads a novel as too much of a statement, as an expression of opinion by an author, rather than as an exploration of ideas, and very simplistically takes what a character in the novel says at face value as being the author's opinion. So the argument we're making in these projects is that the narrative strategies, the aesthetic dimension of a text, the ability of readers to see and understand ambiguities, that matters. And that one of the things that climate change fiction does is to help us understand ambiguities, help us understand trade-offs, help us understand changed perspectives, and to read them as simply conveying facts about climate change misses the point of what these texts do. And one of the things I want to argue is that recent climate change fiction in the last, say, 5 years has been aware of that and does that very cleverly. And so this is what I call the despair or the inspiration model. And so if these are the first two phases of climate change is one issue among many, and climate change, hitting you over the head to try to make you afraid and shock you into doing something. What the third phase has done, again, roughly since 2017, 2018, is that there's still a strong sense of urgency and awareness. And these novels seem aware that those who read climate change fiction don't need wake-up calls. And so we have less info dumping, less, obvious lectures about facts, and we have more of a recognition of inevitability, what I call the sort of loss and mourning type. So novels that describe a drastically changed world and, in a sense, emotionally prepare us for it. Or we have novels that focus on solutions and on generating hope. So an increasing focus on future scenarios and models. And so if you look at my modified chart, what you find is that since about 2018, Fridays for Future begins, you have the IPCC special report on climate change, the oceans and the ice, cryosphere, so Antarctica, the Arctic Greenland, etc. You have Greta Thunberg's I Want You to Panic speech. You have these heat waves. There's an increasing sense that climate change is there already. And so you have in this IPCC report a drastic scenarios of pretty shocking climate change that's pretty imminent. And you have authors like Jonathan Franzen in 2019 writing a very widely discussed essay called What If We Stop Pretending, in which he says the climate catastrophe is coming. To prepare for it, we need to admit that we can't admit it and prepare for the worst. Now, Franzen has very often been accused of defeatism. He's been accused of telling people to give up and not do anything about climate anymore, and to just say we're screwed anyway, we can't prevent it. We might as well enjoy ourselves while we can. None of that is what he says. He says we should still try to limit climate change as far as we can, but we should also face the fact that it's coming, that 1.5 degrees is no longer realistic, and that we need to prepare for the worst while still trying to avert even worse climate change. And so it's probably not a coincidence that in this situation, there are more and more novels that focus on what I call loss and mourning. And so here's one of the, I think, most interesting examples, Charlie McConaughey's Migrations from 2020. And one Washington Post review says, in a future near enough, you could mistake it for the present. So this is set in the future, but it's unclear whether this is 2020, 2021, 2025. It's pretty close. And just a few passages. The novel talks about a nameless sadness, the fading away of the birds. The last birds are dying, the fading away of the animals. How lonely it'll be here when it's just us. No more monkeys in the wild, no chimps or apes or gorillas, nor any big animals. So this is basically a novel that, in its gloom and doom scenarios, prepares us for a world that is a much sadder world, with a loss of biodiversity, a loss of livelihood, and a loss of any kind of appeal in which human beings basically just barely make a living. This is the loss and mourning type. The other type, and I find that both psychologically more interesting, and they're also, I think, the more complex novels, is the stories of successful transformation. So novels that function both as models of, describe climate futures as they are likely, but also model for climate futures and propose scenarios. And I want to talk about two examples here. One is one of the most widely debated climate novels of the last few years anyway, Kim Stanley Robinson, Ministry for the Future. Kim Stanley Robinson is an American science fiction writer. And this is 2020, Minister for the Future. The fiction is that the novel begins with a dramatic heat wave in India in 2023, in which literally millions of people die. And this shocks the world into recognition that something drastic needs to happen. And so the UN founds a Ministry for the Future, some kind of executive branch of the United Nations, with an office in Switzerland tasked with, let's call it, saving the world. And so this is a novel that starts in the 2020s and moves into the 2040s, and basically shows how humanity will have managed. And it does so in a vast range of narrative perspectives. You have chapters in which blockchain code is the speaker, the market has one of the chapters, a photon is a speaker, a carbon atom. So the carbon atom tells the story of how it emerged in a supernova, how it became part of a plant in the early phase of plant life on Earth, how it became part of a dinosaur's body, how it ended up as, pardon my French, dinosaur shit, and how it turned into a CO2 atom, etc. So from the life of a carbon atom through world history, and all of these, I wouldn't even call them characters, but narrators, give you an astonishing range of perspectives and insights into climate change. And one of the early critics of the novel, Geza Maktun, complained basically that Robinson doesn't employ the formal possibilities of literature in dramatizing individual conversions. He says even the two round characters, Mary, the head of this United Nations ministry, and her antagonist, Frank May, lack a realistic novel psychological interiority. So she complains that we don't ever get any kind of inside perspectives into these characters. And the argument is that she says the novel misses out on the chance to give us this kind of inside perspective. Whereas I would argue that it's really the fact that the novel does not provide any internal view, that the novel does not invite any identification with climate heroes that makes it so interesting, because it refuses any such comforting inside perspective and makes it so interesting as an example of climate change communication, simply because I would argue Robinson has understood that simple identification just doesn't work and just doesn't do the trick. What is also striking, I think, is that this novel is extremely conscious of model theory. The novel constantly, in dozens of passages, talks about the importance of climate modeling to the climate science community. It talks about the effects of different types of models. It talks about, in pretty technical detail, some of the technicalities of climate modeling. And then we have a passage in which one of the protagonists, Mary, the head of this UN climate office, goes to California for a site visit to study how California has dealt with climate change. And this is a passage that is full of references to model theory. So California, it says here, ran at carbon neutrality, having established strong policies early on. They were intent to continue that process. What they were doing was a model other people could learn from. And so inside a big warehouse, the US Army Corps of Engineers had created a giant model of the California Bay Area. So a 3D map with interactive water flows, a sort of a 3D model simulation of the Californian water system. Californians told her and showed her how the northern half of the state was now functioning. All this they told Mary while looking down on the pretty model of the landscape, filling the warehouse as if from a small satellite. It looks great, Mary said. I hope we can do this everywhere. Models always look good, Esther said cheerfully, but she was proud of it. Not just the model, but the 3 model they've built, but the state. And back in San Francisco, in a meeting with the world central bankers, on top of the big tower, the view reminded Mary of the day before, looking down on the model of California, but this time it was real. It was the real California. It was vast. And so what this brief passage alone does is it talks about all these different functions of models as a simulated, simplified version of reality in the 3D model. It talks about the model as something other people could imitate, as a blueprint others can learn from. So this both the descriptive representation of something that exists already, the forward-looking, prescriptive, blueprint, normative variation of something as it could be, as it might exist. All of that is there. And at the end, you even have this idea that is central to model theory. You build a model, you abstract from reality, you simplify reality, you study the model, and at some point you've got to return from the model to reality, to fact check the model, to check the results of what the model tells you against reality. And so even this move back from the model to reality, even that is suggested in the novel. One of the crucial passages, excuse me for a second. One of the things I would argue we need to do when we read that novel is to understand how fiction works, because there is a widely discussed passage that was quoted in a lot of reviews where there's talk of eco-terrorism. And so let's look at the following passage and see how that might work. So this is at some point in the 2030s. Everyone alive knew that not enough was being done to fight climate change, and the pressure kept building. So it was not really a surprise when the day came in the 2030s at some point that 60 passenger jets crashed in a matter of hours. Clouds of small drones had been directed into flight path of the planes involved, fouling their engines. One message was fairly obvious: stop flying. And indeed, many people stopped. Eco-terrorists in the novel also sink diesel-fueled container ships. They assassinate oil executives, and so they resort to violent means of eco-activism, eco-sabotage, assassinations, etc. And so one of the questions is, it works. 60 planes are shot down, thousands of people die, millions of lives are saved because people stop flying. That's good for the climate. Does that mean the novel suggests, okay, let's go shoot down planes, that will solve the climate crisis? So even in the most cynical reading, where you would say in a purely sort of cynically utilitarian idea, killing a few thousand people to save millions, great, works, let's do it. It seems very simplistic to read the novel that way. But a number of reviewers have argued that violence towards petrocapitalist structures by agents from the global south, so eco-terrorism, shooting down planes, etc., is portrayed in the novel as justified, even necessary, as a form of anti-imperial struggle for survival. So this is the simplistic reading that says characters in a novel do something, it seems to work, and that suggests that the novel proposes that that's what we should do. I think a more subtle reading of the novel would be this. Doris Ahne, in one of the most, I think, subtle reviews, says, a novel beginning in a recognizable present and ending in a desirable and more sustainable future. Is this maybe not so much literature as activism? And ultimately, is this a form of activism that propagates violence? It's not that simple. Robinson is too good a storyteller to make his novel the vehicle of a message. So Ministry for the Future is not a how-to manual. Here's what we do, here's what we should do in the form of a novel, but a detached exploration of the dynamics that might turn a world driven by the forces of inertia into one of change. So what a number of critics, I think, have done is they have misread an explorative attempt at trying out what might happen. Let's imagine climate change continues. Let's imagine all of the COP conferences fail. Let's imagine nothing happens. Is it so totally implausible that some people in the 2030s might resort to shooting down planes? It's an option. It's possible. I don't think the novel says, let's go do it. It says, it's something that might happen. And so to misread novels as, to misread novels as how-to manuals, as opposed to, texts that try out what might happen, is, I think, to misread novels as blueprints, where what they really do is to explore possible scenarios. And so here's another text that in some sense is remarkably similar. Stephen Martley's The Deluge 2023 is at some point called, there's a task force in the 2030s that's tasked with saving the world, and they call themselves, ironically, the Task Force to Unfuck the World, pardon my French. And so this is, almost 900 pages starting in 2014, going to the 2040s. A long, detailed, self-reflexive discussion of climate change communication. There's a lot of questions of class, education, privilege. There's a lot of talk that much climate change fiction is fiction by white men. There's a pretty drastic representation of environmental disaster, but it's ultimately somewhat hopeful about the future. And there's a wealth of characters: eco-activists, climate scientists, politicians, and ex-drug addict business executives, eco-terrorists, their families, social circles. So dozens of characters who increasingly come to be shown in their interconnections. Plus, spoiler warning, it's a novel that has one of the most graphic depictions of the murder of a protagonist you've probably rather come to like, that I can think of in all of literary history. So it's a novel that in many ways does not fulfill expectations. It's a novel that doesn't tell a linear story. We have a problem now, but we'll be all right. It's a novel that is very drastic about climate change, but that also is vaguely optimistic. And so what it does is it uses a range of perspectives: first person, second person, third person, scientific accounts, political memos, scientific essays, newspaper headings. So this is a page from the novel from the earlier 2000s, talking about people we know, Kim and Kanai, so Kardashian, etc. So famous people talking about Malaysian flight. This is a plane that actually crashed. So MH370 is a plane that actually did disappear. So these are newspaper clippings that realistically tie the novel to its time of origin. Or you have pages like this where you have info boxes telling you things about the background of characters, parallel versions of the same story, alternative scenarios. It's really a very challenging, very complex novel with a lot of different strategies, and a novel that is especially good, I think, in pointing out different perspectives. So there isn't the one climate scientist who knows how the world must be saved. It's a novel that also talks about contradictions, ambivalences, inconsistencies, blind spots in activist perspectives. So some of the most heated, aggressive debates are not between climate activists and climate deniers, but the most interesting, fascinating, controversial debates take place within the group of climate activists that are one focus of the novel. And so in many ways, the novel does an extreme amount of info dumping, a wealth of scientific facts, but in a way that seems remarkably subtle. It's if a wealth of characters from a vast range of countries, social groups, social classes, ethnic groups, different groups of society give you these insight into different parts of climate change, the novel makes very, very clear that everything's connected to everything else. It makes decades of climate change and struggle against climate change perceivable by individuals in ways that an abstract scenario wouldn't do, and in very, very complex ways shows that everything's connected to everything else. And it literally has dozens of references to climate modeling, very detailed discussions of different types of models, the advantages of modeling, the disadvantages of some types of models. It discusses novels both in the sort of analytical and in its predictive function. It draws connections between models and imagination, models and narrative, the question whether models can also be narrative, the question whether a novel could be a model. So the novel seems, excuse me, extremely conscious of the fact that it will itself be read as a novel, and that it is in some sense an extremely complex model of and a model for climate change discussion. So brief conclusion, in the last few years, we've had novels that are much more aware than previous novels about the problems of climate change communication. So they no longer preach quite so much. They no longer believe that cuddly animals will lead people to change their behavior. They know that simple identification just doesn't work. There seems to be an increasing awareness that we need to read fiction as fiction, and that using a novel to just convey facts simply doesn't work, because processes of identification, processes of perspective taking, of seeing the world from a different angle is central to how these texts work. And I think it's both become central to a lot of climate change fiction and to a lot of climate change fiction research, that these novels very often function as models and are aware of the fact that they function as models. And so knowing about model theory helps give more subtle readings and to understand better how they work. And some of these recent novels, and my two examples I think make that very clear, are very explicit about the importance of modeling, and basically know that they themselves function as models, but they also talk about the limitations of modeling. And so CliFi increasingly, rather than hitting readers over their head with ideas of how to behave, increasingly try to model climate futures in the sense of developing scenarios, developing possible futures, playing through different options, showing what might happen, as opposed to saying this is what you need to do. And if anyone's interested in more detail, here's a link, and I'm happy to share the presentation. I think it's on your platform already. The links are there. It's open access, and I'm happy to discuss, and I'm happy to answer questions if you have any. Let me end the screen sharing so I can see you, and I'm happy to discuss if you like. Thank you. Rainer, you're still muted.
So, okay, we have the first question.
Thank you very much for the presentation and the facts around about climate fiction. It's just out of interest for the novels itself. Do they just depict climate change as like heat waves, or they also represent an alternative weather, like not just heat waves or ice era? I don't know. It's just of interest.
We have all sorts of varieties. Especially some of the earlier novels basically just describe a warmer world. Some of the more recent novels obviously seem to be aware that 1.5 degrees global warming doesn't mean everything will sort of linearly become 1.5 degrees warmer, but knows that things will just become more extreme. Some extremely dry areas will be even drier. Some areas that have heavy rainfalls already will have even heavier rainfalls. Thunderstorms will be worse. Storms will be worse. And so the insight that we have from scientific climate modeling, that this will just mean more extreme weather events in all directions, including, as we now know, the North Atlantic circulation, that there will also be areas of the world that will become significantly cooler, especially in Northern Europe, and that this is very far from being good news. This is very clear in some of the more recent novels. They really have, Deluge is a good example, 880 pages. There is so much climate science there that the scenarios of weather extremes, extreme scenarios, are pretty realistic and very close to what very recent science tells us is probably going to happen and is happening already. I hope that helps.
It's just some addition to what you've said. It's because my investigation is around weather phenomena in Latin American novels. So I'm just reading a novel by Fernanda Trias, Mugre Rosa. I think it's Rosa Schleim, something like that. And it's very interesting because there the weather is, there's the toxic winds. So that was just my idea of alternative weather, if it's also depicted like a really other climates, other weather in these novels. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we also have that. One example of that would, for instance, be Anedi Okafor Noor, a Nigerian-American writer who has a sort of an African futurist novel that combines indigenous African traditions with high tech. And one of the things that you have there is artificially induced storms that are, used by let's say that the climate industrial complex, you could say, to generate energy, etc. So you have a vast range of different scenarios of what might happen: toxic winds, catastrophic storms, some realistic scenarios, some more unrealistic scenarios. There's really now a wealth of different, a range of different options and different things that climate novels do in representing future scenarios. Could you mention that the novel that you've just said? I'd like to sort of make a note of that.
Also die deutsche Übersetzung ist Rosa Schleim von Fernanda Trias, eine Schriftstellerin aus Uruguay.
Oh, thanks. I'll find that.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, other questions? From the online participants, you just can type in the chat question, then we can answer it. Well, one question from my side, how can scientists come in contact with authors just to use this medium of novels to connect science and arts? Do you have some ideas how this could work?
I think it's something that's happening already. It's one of the ways that especially more recent climate fiction that has moved closer to scientific scenarios has tried to do exactly that. There is, of course, the argument that Greg Garrett has made, one of the, I think, leading climate fiction critics. He said that novelists are not the public relations department of the IPCC. So we shouldn't expect that what novels do is public relations for climate science. And I totally agree that isn't how novels work. But one of the things that this would be my argument, that what novels do is exactly that. They make the scientific predictions of scientific climate modeling more tangible, more individually perceivable than any mathematical model could do. And so, yes, I think they would quintessentially be an attempt at bridging science and the arts. Is the question in the chat I'm just seeing?
Yeah, but since it's just a sensitive topic do you feel that people misinterpret fiction of future climates often for the predictions and criticize the content more and are less calm with unexpected negative turns?
That's a question that's in fact being debated. To what extent it's the Schneider-Meyerson example of what I think is a misreading of a novel suggests that very often these novels are read below their potential. They are either read as, what do they tell me about climate change, conveying the facts, or they seem instruction manuals. What should I do? And the argument I would make is that it's not the function of novels to tell you what to do. That's to tap into fiction below what it's capable of doing. But what I think is happening, and this is another argument that people have made, is that increasingly drastic representations of climate change in fiction might make people sort of give up, might create this defeatist sense of, we're lost anyway, might as well give up. And another argument, make them more or less calm with unexpected negative terms, as you ask. One of the arguments that have been made about the gloom and doom disaster novels, such as Migration, is that the cultural work these novels do is to emotionally prepare us for the worst. That they are, in a sense, some kind of emotional preparation for disaster, and that is a culturally valid form. It's not, I find, the most useful thing fiction can do. I just tend to find the more explorative, future-oriented, playing through scenarios, maybe even generating hope that it's still possible to do something without simplistically optimistic saying, technology will find a way, don't you worry, we'll be okay. I think that's one of the most interesting functions, to explore futures as opposed to predicting futures or telling us what a good future would be. I think all of these don't do justice to what fiction is capable of doing. Does that make sense?
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, other questions? There's no other question. Also in the chat. Thank you from the online participants. Okay, then I would say also thank you very much from my side, and yeah, looking forward to see you next year. In the upcoming year, we have 2 new lectures. Yeah, thank you to the audience for discussion, and I'll see you next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.